Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Reverend Tom Capo and I'm the minister of People's Church Unitarian Universalist, and I'll be your moderator for this morning's show. Today we're going to talk about the consequences of the legalization of the medical use of the herb cannabis or marijuana. The Iowa Pharmacy Board was ordered ordered this year by a district court judge to consider whether marijuana has accepted medical use in the United States. So far, 20 states plus the District of Columbia have deemed that marijuana has accepted medical use and have legalized it with a doctor's prescription. Instead of asking whether marijuana has accepted medical use in the United States, the board asked whether Iowa should approve it, which was a question of the legislature. So some bills were introduced, HF 22 and SF 79, and the House and the Senate didn't take up these bills in the fall, although they were introduced in the fall. They'll be looked at in January. These bills would exempt patients in Iowa suffering from cancer, HIV/AIDS, ALS, severe pain and nausea, and other ailments from arrest or prosecution for using medical marijuana. Patients and their caregivers would be given the ability to grow their own marijuana or to purchase it from a nonprofit dispensary. Even if these bills pass, unfortunately, Governor Branstad has said he will oppose this medical marijuana. So we're going to consider the pros and cons, the benefits and dangers of making this drug legal for here in Iowa for people to use. So I've got a panel here to help me sort through this issue. And immediately to my left here is Jerry Vandersaden, is that right?
That's correct, Vandersaden.
Yep, and he's the Linn County attorney?
Correct.
All right, and to his immediate left is Carl Olson, who's a web developer at Drake University. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And far left over here is Dr. Andrew Peterson, who is a neurologist here in Cedar Rapids. Again, thank you all for being here.
Sure thing.
Sure.
Well, let's start with some background on this. Why do you think 20 states have legalized medical marijuana? Have some of y'all thought about this, or have you heard about this? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, there's no doubt that I think societal views about marijuana, medical marijuana, have changed over the years, and I think that the state legislatures throughout the country are also changing in view of the more of the acceptance, I guess, of marijuana use. And I think part of it has to do with a perception among many that the war on drugs has failed. And I think a lot of state governments are just looking for a new approach or trying for a different approach. And part of it, I think, is if you can't beat them, join them sort of mentality. But I also believe that there are many state governments, local governments that are attracted to the potential for added revenue. Many states and localities are strapped for cash and they're looking for new revenue streams, and I believe that they see marijuana as offering great potential to help them with their budgetary problems.
Carl, you want to add anything to that?
Well, historically, marijuana was accepted in the United States before 1970. There was actually an exemption from medical use in the Marijuana Tax Act, which was a federal drug law before the one that we have now. Marijuana is the only thing that's classified as not being medicine that's ever been accepted by a state. A commission was appointed to study it when it was made illegal, and they recommended decriminalization. I participated in a study in the late 70s that was published in Science magazine in 1981 on a cognitive functioning study, and I scored in the upper 0.1% of the population IQ while I was using marijuana. The DEA held hearings on this in the 80s, and I submitted that study and participated in that. In 1988, the judge ruled that marijuana in its natural form is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. And the administrator of the DEA reversed that decision. It went through appeals, and it ended up in 1994. The court the court upheld the rejection by the administrator. And then in '96, you saw this voter initiative in California legalizing marijuana for medical use. So I think people kind of were frustrated with the federal process and decided to take matters into their own hands, and you can see that it's just been continuing to gain momentum since then.
Andrew?
I think there's sort of two parts to it. One, there are some real medical uses for marijuana or its derivatives. Most of the studies are incredibly poor. They're biased from the start by the people who are for or against it. And it's also hard to do a study because it's illegal, so you can't get it to do any kind of controlled studies. So the data is not very good. It does work for the HIV/AIDS wasting syndrome, where there's loss of appetite and weight loss. I've actually used it a couple times in that disorder in the past. It's appropriate for the nausea and vomitings people have that's just intractable with chemotherapy. And there are other uses that are looked at and have been looked at for pain and those things. Again, I think the data is not so great. I really think that marijuana prohibition is about as successful as the prohibition was when it came to alcohol. You know, some huge percent of the population has tried marijuana at one point or another, and all it's done is boost criminal activity and cause other problems. I suspect that the state's moves to go to medical use of marijuana is an interim step towards legalization, like is now occurring in Colorado and Washington, I think it was. Right. I think it's an in-between step. Because in California, when they approved medical marijuana, anybody can go get a little card saying, gee, I need marijuana because my toe hurts or something. And so it's a de facto legalization, although it's not really there. And you know, I don't have huge amounts of data on this, but that's my impression of it.
So what you said, and kind of going along with what you're saying as well, is essentially the war on drugs, especially the war on marijuana, has been unsuccessful and has resulted in a lot of people being put in jail for...
Absolutely. Think of all the kids and teenagers who, you know, you get a little criminal record because they're smoking a joint in the parking lot or something. I think marijuana use has implications for society as a whole. Just like you shouldn't drive drunk, you shouldn't drive when somebody's under the influence of marijuana. You don't want your surgeon or your whoever who's some professional in charge of things to be under the influence of anything when they're doing stuff. I think it's probably less toxic than alcohol or tobacco. It doesn't seem to cause lung disease the way tobacco does. There's just not been a lot of bad stuff associated with it. There's anecdotal reports of all sorts of things, but you know, that's like me holding up the latest snake oil and saying I want to sell something. It seems to be relatively safe as a whole. Again, the data's not very good. But certainly in terms of lung disease, I don't think inhaling smoke is good for your lungs, but there's no connection between marijuana and COPD, whereas there's this huge connection with tobacco and COPD.
Let me follow up on with you just a little bit, because you mentioned about the research, and obviously you're in the medical community here in Cedar Rapids, and you have connections with, I imagine, medical community across the United States. What does the medical community think about all this?
Oh, I think it's very divided. But it's like any other topic. There's a whole range of personalities and how people feel about things. I mean, I think most people I've talked to about it think it has marginal use in medicine, partly because it's an herbal extract, and so it's not standardized. And joint A is not the same as joint B, the same as joint C, as opposed to a pill that's purified by the pharmaceutical company. Pharmaceutical companies are investing a lot of money into marijuana and its analogs. If they can come out with a pill that does X, Y, or Z, and it's the same dose every time, you know, and it gets accepted, it'll be worth a lot of money to them, which that's a different sort of issue altogether. But things just not well standardized is one of the issues. Germany has a big history of using herbal medicine, you know, so doctors write prescriptions for it. It's not the case in the U.S.
Did you want to add something? You look like you were...
I was deep in thought. But my main concern is, I guess, I have a healthy skepticism about medical marijuana because I think it's being driven now by politics. And I like to see it driven more by medical research and science. But as the doctors indicated, there isn't a lot of research in this regard. And what concerns me is that California and Oregon, I think, were the first two states that approved medical marijuana. But I'm very concerned about the experience they have had with it. And even though Oregon Washington and Colorado recently decriminalized marijuana for small amounts, what's kind of, I guess, hidden in the shuffle is that California and Oregon, the first two states that allowed for medical marijuana use, also had votes at the very same issue and voted the legalization of marijuana down. And I think that for the very reasons that the doctors talked about in California, it's almost a standing joke about how easy it is to get medical marijuana. And there are many communities in California and Oregon that just have had it. And there are cities and counties now that through the regulation of certain restrictions have outlawed medical marijuana dispensaries in their communities just because it's really become a front for drug trafficking. So I'm more concerned about medical marijuana if there's going to be a push for it, that it come from science and from the field of medicine and not from the political arena.
Okay. Well, you had some experience with the politics of this, didn't you, Carl?
Well,
And the pharmacy, for that matter.
knowing that it's a difficult road here in Iowa, and hearing what I just heard from Jerry, we went to the Board of Pharmacy and asked them to help us out, and they voted unanimously that it's medicine and that it should be removed from the classification that says it's not medicine, and they recommended that we set up a program. But they're not a bunch of hippies, and they're not a bunch of counterculture folk, so they're not going to recommend something radical, and I doubt they're going to recommend that we do what California did, or Oregon. So the legislature hasn't listened to them yet and hasn't done anything, but they haven't addressed it either. They haven't rejected it. So we're still after the board, and we won a court ruling last week saying, no, you still have to participate. You're not done yet. We still need your help.
Who is we?
Well, I say we. I have an organization called Iowans for Medical Marijuana. I'm the sole director and the sole member of it, but I have a list of hundreds of people that subscribe to my list. The reason I'm the sole member of it is I don't use marijuana, and so I'm not worried about getting arrested. But the other members, I have to protect them, so I don't keep a list that I'm going to share with people of who these folks are. But I guess, well, anyway, we want the Board of Pharmacy to look at the legislation and give us advice on how to tweak it and everything. They said they liked the New Mexico program best of all the state programs. And so we drafted a bill like New Mexico, and then we asked them to tweak it, which is what we're fighting about right now. They say they don't want nothing more to do with it, but we're saying, you have to, because if you're not going to participate, we're going to have something like California. I mean, there's a chance that we could end up with something like California.
So what's the difference between these two bills? I mean, the ones in California and the ones in New Mexico, right?
Well, it's my understanding that the one in California doesn't specify any particular condition, that it's just if a doctor says you need it, you can have it. Here in Iowa, well, in New Mexico, they have a list of conditions. The Department of Public Health can add or subtract conditions to the list. It's all very well vetted, and in California, it's not so government friendly. I mean, it's kind of like a voter initiative, I mean, it wasn't done through the legislature. Voter initiatives take precedent over legislation, so the legislature can't touch it They'd have to put another ballot initiative on the ballot to make an amendment to it. So, you know, and another thing is, like, we want to cooperate with the federal government. We want the federal government to cooperate with us. And so having the Board of Pharmacy find that it doesn't meet the Class 1 criteria here in Iowa, well, they're the same criteria the federal government uses. So we immediately have a finding that it doesn't meet the federal criteria. At the same time, we find it doesn't meet the state criteria, so we could make an intelligent argument the federal government has to cooperate with us. And so that's why our approach is different. It's a matter of necessity. We didn't have the luxury or the whatever. We don't have a voter initiative, so we couldn't just throw this to the people. But look what we've done. We've thrown it to the experts. And they have come out in our favor. So, and I guess I should say my attorney. I just got a really good attorney that's helping me out. And so, like, he is awesome. And the ACLU helped me the first time around, and they were awesome.
Right. And to be clear, I think there are some appropriate medical indications for it. There's some others that are coming up. There's been some anecdotal reports of cannabis oil, which does not have any of the active mood-altering ingredients in it, being profoundly effective for a few epilepsy patients.
Yeah, I was seeing Dr. Sanjay Gupta's series on CNN.
Right,
So
right.
this oil.
Right, it's really striking. This one child in particular who having multiple seizures per day just failed everything and seizure-free for a year on this. It's certainly not a placebo effect, but they're seizure-free for a year. You know, like anything else, will it work for everybody? Probably not, but that's profoundly interesting. I mean, we have epilepsy patients that are really hard to treat, some of them, and have something which can turn off the seizures in a young child is just phenomenal. I think there's many things like that out there, but again, these are individual case reports. It's not a controlled double-blinded study of 8,000 people or something. So I think the science is really still lagging behind. I think what is clear, from at least from the observational stuff, is that it's relatively safe. I'm sure undoubtedly, you know, you can have a problem with an aspirin. People can have problems with some of these things. But I think it's reasonably safe. I think it has some clear medical indications. It's just snarled up in the politics and emotions that are roaring around the country, and that makes it difficult for everybody.
Well, you said something about that. You don't want it to be part of the politics. How do you see it here in Iowa?
Well, I think that any sort of substance that's going to be approved for medical use should go through FDA approval process. And I think the FDA actually has approved certain components of marijuana for medical use. I think there's a pill called Marinol that's been approved for certain medical uses, and it's undergone FDA approval. It's been proven safe and effective. You can get it by prescription in all 50 states, and it's legal. But otherwise, the broad use of marijuana has not received FDA approval, and I think that if marijuana is going to be approved for medical use, it ought to go through the scrutiny and the scientific study that any other medicine has to go through to be approved for medical use. And my concern is that when the state, when a government entity sanctions a substance like marijuana as being used in a legitimate way for medicine, it gives it a good name and a certain legitimacy that it has not earned, not yet anyway, until we have further scientific study on this. And I think it deserves serious discussion and further study, but that the movement, if there is going to be a movement towards marijuana as medicine, it needs to come from science and from the medical community, and not from the political process, because we all have seen what the political process can create.
So let me ask, because we haven't really talked about, what are the downside of medical marijuana? What are the problems that we might foresee? I think you mentioned one of them before, because if you grow it, you don't know if you're getting a low THC,
Right. There's various preparations. I think the genetics, certainly the people in Oregon and California have gone a long ways in the genetics of growing cannabis. Again, I don't know that much about it.
Yeah.
But I believe the current strains that are grown are much more potent than they used to be. And you can pick strains that have more of this or more of that.
More of...
Well, there's THC and the other DHC. There's two
CBD is-
CBD. There's two major compounds with differing effects, and by boosting one or the other, you have differing responses in people.
Those are the two most well-known.
Right, and there's loads of others.
yeah.
Yeah, there's loads and loads. It's a complicated mishmash of compounds. So there is some standardization, but you know, if I grow rosemary as an herb and pick it in the morning or pick in the afternoon, the concentration of oils and flavor is different, and which is true of plant products. They're affected by the time of year, the growing season, the heat, the humidity. Think of all the different kinds of coffee you can get at Starbucks. They're all different altitudes, different locations.
Apples.
Right, right, and there's little variability. So again, if you're looking at it in terms of dosing a medical problem, I want consistency. If you're looking at it, is this as safe as alcohol or tobacco? That's a political issue. Okay, but if it's my understanding of the politics of it, marijuana use, marijuana crimes is a large chunk of time spent for the justice system, prison population, this, that, and the other, and it's, you know, to me, it's kind of a waste of time. It's a waste of money. I'd much rather, you know, spend a third less on prisons and not need to spend that money on prisons, put into social reforms or taking care of children or something.
Or recovery centers. You could
makes a lot more economic sense to
Sure.
me. And then one of the other issues is it's a gateway drug. I mean, I remember in high school, it goes back a ways, we got to see the thing that J. Edgar put out, the little marijuana film. It was hilarious looking back at it. And very little research is done on marijuana as a gateway drug. So NIH, National Institutes of Health, on their website has a small study that was done looking at this. Alcohol and tobacco are gateway drugs for marijuana use. The reverse is not true. So marijuana use does not promote alcohol or tobacco use. Implication being that marijuana is not a gateway drug, whereas alcohol and tobacco are, and they're illegal, marijuana is not. We know the prohibition, all it did was promote organized crime, didn't do anything else, and marijuana seems kind of similar to me. I've heard 40% of the population, some huge number of the population has tried it at one point or another.
It's not good criminalizing that many people.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, certainly there is that component of it. I think people have pointed out that a large segment of the African American community has been essentially taken out of the political process because they have used marijuana and got arrested.
Iowa holds the honor of having the highest disparity, or the dishonor.
So, what would be some of your concerns from a legal standpoint? Are there some other things besides politics that would be problematic for you?
Well, I'm concerned about the perception that can be created by legalizing marijuana or legalizing marijuana for medical purposes. Just the impression, I think the false impression it would give to many that it's a safe and benign drug. I don't believe that it is. I think that it is a gateway drug. I think if you did a survey of people that use harder drugs, like cocaine or methamphetamine, you'd find they started out with marijuana. And I think there are dangerous side effects of marijuana, especially those who are engaged in long-term chronic users of marijuana, I think, experience health problems. And I'm concerned about giving the impression that marijuana is safe to use. I don't believe that it is, but I think it deserves some serious study as to whether certain components of marijuana can be used in a legitimate medical way.
Cocaine and methamphetamine are both legal for medical use.
Well, if they're modified, I mean, obviously.
Well,
cocaine
cocaine is used in eye drops. Ophthalmology uses it occasionally. Methamphetamine, not so much. I mean, other amphetamine
But
forms.
it's a Schedule II controlled
It's a Schedule
substance,
II,
which
but
is what the Iowa Board of Pharmacy recommended that we do with marijuana. So they're saying that we should make marijuana like cocaine and methamphetamine instead of lying about it and saying that it's worse than...
What is Schedule II? Okay, we know what Schedule I is, that there's no medical use. What's Schedule II?
Schedule I and Schedule II are both identical as far as abuse potential. The only difference between them is whether something has accepted medical use or not.
So Schedule II is it does have some medical use. Is that
Right.
correct?
Correct.
With severe restrictions.
With severe restrictions.
Right.
Okay.
So Schedule II, I can write a prescription for it. Schedule I, somebody buys on the street corner.
Okay. So what about addiction? I mean, we hear this all the time, that, you know, marijuana is addictive. medical?
Again, I don't know the research on that very well. I've seen different numbers quoted about it. There are people who are chronic heavy users of it, just like people who drink chronically or smoke chronically. In terms of people who are exposed to go on to be chronic heavy users, like daily users, I think the percentage is lowish, but I don't know that I believe any of the numbers that I've seen, again, because the data is poor and contaminated. I think it's with the Rastafarians, it's part of their religion, so they have an exemption on that basis. I know when I was in college, there was a lot of smoke blowing around campus, and most of the people went on to be successful. And I don't think most of them are chronic users. So some of it is situational stuff that happens as well. There's other things like kava, which is that's a legal herbal thing. It's commonly used in the Pacific Islands. It's a very relaxing kind of sort of similar calming effects according to a lot of people. So again, there are other things that are out there and stuff. Do you know anything about addiction? I don't know the data.
I was a chronic user for 20 years, and I quit cold turkey and never used it again and didn't notice any.
And there's difference between psychological behavior or addiction. Things that are addictive, you have withdrawal symptoms when you stop. Now, somebody's on heroin and quits, it's a horrible withdrawal. Alcoholic who quits and goes through the DTs, I mean, some of them die. And marijuana has not shown that. Nicotine withdrawal does not usually kill you unless it's combined with a lot of other things that are going wrong at the time, but it's not pleasant at all. And I think people can just start or stop marijuana, suggesting it is not addiction. There may be a psychological dependence on it, like there is on all sorts of things, but not typical addiction. And again,
I decided to be addicted to it for 20 years and then decided not to, and I haven't used it for 23 years, so it's just, people like it.
Well,
they want to use it all the time.
Are there other dangers or anything that besides obviously the dosage, are there other dangers that we should consider?
Well, there are a couple of things. There's some anecdotal reports of stroke in a couple of people, and it does have what we call sympathomimetic effects. So it can raise your pulse and blood pressure slightly when you first start it. The couple of reports I saw, people had multiple other things that could have caused stroke. So it's unclear whether it really was a cause or not. And again, given the amount of the population that's used it, if it was a common cause of stroke, there'd be a lot of case reports, and there's one or two out there. There's concerns over lung disease because it's smoke inhaling, and there's microparticles. Will that trigger asthma in people or surrounding people? It's not been shown to do that. The major people that had issues with lung disease were also smoking tobacco. Those that did not smoke tobacco did not seem to get the lung disease. Again, not huge series. These are more case reports, observational things, which is not great science.
Wow, we need to hear more about this, but we're not going to be able to right now. I really appreciate all of your. I think you brought some real insight into these issues, and maybe people out there can be thinking about this when it comes up before the legislature. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for joining us here on Ethical Perspectives on the News. Take care, everyone.